Hello, in this video I want to continue the series that I've been doing with settler colonialism and space privatization. I think that settler colonialism is a really core criticism for the space resolution because I feel like thinking about how we're able to explore spaces outside of Earth is like a really good way to think about and consume the way in which like discovery, other questions of like land clearing and the repurposing of like other sources of like land and resources, etc., are really like key and endemic to the conversation that settler colonialism is really having. And settler colonialism studies is really like raising in terms of like trying to remember the ways in which like that accumulation is created on Earth via like forms of indigenous genocide, and the way in which that logic kind of continues into like the everyday political cultural decisions we make about like how we distribute and think about the usage of like resources, and like the way in which we think about the place of various kind of like racialized others in relationship to like what is kind of like used in the concept of like utility or like how repurposing. And I think that being able to ask questions about like how this particular resolution is able to bring to bear and answer questions that like is raised by settler colonialism, I think is really important for any team, whether you're trying to read critical arguments or policy ones, or trying to figure out if you're trying to answer settler colonialism or read it. I think that just having a better understanding of just like what this critique is trying to do overall can only make it a lot easier for you to kind of like enter these debates from whatever standpoint. And so hopefully this video is helpful as we start to talk about how policy teams can better respond to settler colonialism. In this video, I kind of want to start off by just thinking about like what are some of the priorities when you're answering settler colonialism, and then what are kind of the framing and thesis concerns that frame a lot of the questions and conversations that you'll want to have outside of this particular debate. And I think that being able to kind of like understand how those kind of like using the framing and thesis is able to frame particular concerns like the link perm impact comparison alternative debate is really helpful for just having like a better understanding of like the way that you want to kind of like think about the resolution as a whole, and the way that you're positioning like what core kind of critiques you really want to have answers to. I think that when I'm trying to figure out what are some of the priorities against this particular type of argument, I think that kind of like I said when I was doing like the other side of this, where I was talking about how to make settler colonialism work on the side of policy teams, I think that for policy teams a big emphasis is the question of the inevitability of space. I think if you can prove that space is kind of like an inevitable site that we need to be able to figure out how to operationalize, and that like we should be thinking about this in the context of like how can we save humanity and how we can keep humanity alive, then you're able to subsume a lot of the arguments that I think other teams are going to be probably making in this area. Because I feel like a lot of the things that policy teams just really need to zone in on is being able to have like a particular pivot of offense that allows you to access things like whether or not you want to go for a permutation or just go for a straight impact outweighs debate. And so I think that this kind of like inevitability question about like the role that space just kind of plays in the development of just like life as like time evolves and stuff like that is super important to like how policy teams are kind of setting up the uniqueness for why their affirmative is important. Because I feel like once you've made the argument that space is like an inevitable thing, and that whether or not like particularly the plan is able to get past, someone will end up in space, and that has like really like strong bearings on our ability to think about like how we're able to think about the survival of humanity and like what type of like resources, etc., that we need, how they're kind of like distributed, etc., and like what people get access to them. And all those questions can only really be answered by the way in which the affirmative is kind of like pausing in those things, that I think that they're in a much worse position in terms of just being able to refuse and not really have an answer for like what we do in the inevitable like instance that other folks travel to space, which is something that I think the resolution like gives a lot of uniqueness for, considering that it's making such a big argument about like the way in which privatized space exploration is something that is like coming now and like has a particular effect on the way in which space is kind of like thought of as a global commons or not. And so I think making arguments about like why the at least baseline of getting rid of like space privatization in and of itself is good can be really helpful in terms of being able to like show that you kind of have a stronger door like where you really want to center your offense and build it from, which I'll kind of like talk about as we continue going throughout this video. I think that when you kind of like switch some of this advice to like what I think that you should be doing on the framing portion of the debate, I think that framing the debate is really a big question of like how you're able to kind of like take this kind of like goal that we've isolated in the priorities above and make it so that the judge's evaluation is able to make sense of that. I think that weighing the affirmative is important, but weighing the affirmative doesn't mean that you win impact comparison. It just means that the judge can consider your impacts. So I think that either A, you need an argument within your kind of like framing portion that already starts to explain to the judge why being able to view like death as a kind of like moral bad, or like being able to understand like life is a moral good, and like the way in which we kind of like move towards those things as like really important factors for how we're able to make political and ethical decisions is super important to kind of like have like earlier on in the debate. Because I think the more arguments you can make about like what type of value you think is produced by being able to think about life on the terms of biological life and death, and why that's like the best way to be able to promote various other ways of like being able to live life because of the way in which like all life ends at the end of the biological right, I think could be like really interesting ways in which you kind of like take some of your arguments about how you want the affirmative to be weighed and start applying them to like something that's more specific to the crux of what you want your strategy to be. It also means that the more that you're kind of like framing these things, the easier it'll be later on when you're trying to do specific impact analysis, that you can kind of like win that there is a way in which the our arguments that you're making about like space in general have like a proximity to the way in which they're thinking about the impacts of settler colonialism in the way that that creates the foundation for space. And I think that can allow you to really have some play on the way in which they're kind of like thinking about impact calculus and where we should kind of be focusing our energy, all of which I think is like really important for how you're kind of like figuring out your overall strategy against this type of criticism. I then think that when you move to the thesis portion of the debate, I think there needs to be a big focus on just like analyzing the status quo in our relationship to space and like why the affirmative kind of like intervention into those processes is particularly good. I feel like a really big analysis of the way in which like privatized space opens up the sphere for like settler colonialism to basically become something that is ontologized through the virtual science and technology that is produced by privatized companies that see no other gain than like the individual, and that can only see like the resourcification of these like various sources of like violence and things like that as like particularly necessary to their ability to like go out to space and to realize the desires that have like been uplifted by like white capitalistic science. And I think that making arguments about like why the kind of like refusal to be able to see the transition from space away from privatized means to global commons is necessary for at least a shift in the way in which we're thinking about distribution and like who has access to various regions in space. And it's important to stop like the space like from private entities from creating a monopolization on such place, which could heavily restrict and or create like even more inequality from the way in which we're able to create more sacrifices for those that are left behind in the conversations about space already. And so you need to kind of like start the debate from the place of things can get worse and be able to make arguments from that thesis to kind of like frame why there's such a pressing reason for you to be able to kind of like use space use like the public kind of like relationship to space in order to like resolve things like space debris in order to create science and technology that resolve like climate for those that are more marginalized and things like that, all of which I think are really necessary considerations to make about like how a kind of like public apparatus that runs space changes the terms of like what types of demands and things are really sustainable and necessary and good for the human population, rather than relying on like private entities that can only kind of be like shaped through like which way in which they're best able to ascend into space as a whole. Hopefully this video is helpful for you, and hopefully you'll be able to use it as I begin to kind of talk about some other stuff with settler colonialism in space, and definitely in the next video as we finish this particular part of the series out. And yeah, thank you as always for watching.